do a lot of things here. We do lectures, workshops, we do art exhibits. We have Art During a Pandemic coming up, which is a collective of, I think it's about 11 artists that created art during the pandemic. And there'll be some blurbs on their process and kind of what it's like to make art during these very difficult times. And that'll be, the opening for that I think is March, hold on, let me think about this. Oh, it's on here, sorry. And I don't have my reading glasses on. March 4th is the opening of Art During a Pandemic. And this will be great because what we're going to do is we'll have all the art up, but also we're going to have some music that people wrote during this pandemic. We'll have poetry. John Barry, who's here tonight, he's going to be reading a beautiful poem that he wrote in the beginning of the pandemic that was just a great poem. And also John's going to be doing kind of an interactive poetry thing where, well, you'll see the night of. It's very cool. I'm not going to give it away. It's kind of a surprise. So that'll be cool. And that's March 4th. 6 o'clock the doors open, 7 o'clock the performances, and the poetry start. And if anybody here has a poem or a story that they want to share that night, let me know because we could use more spots. Wendy, I'm looking at you. And Sean.
And Diana.
Yes, and Diana too, yeah. So anyway, we have a lot coming up. On March 5th, after the Art During a Pandemic, we have Miss Tess, who's a wonderful rock and roll blues singer, great guitar player. We have our dinner and a show series, which has gone great. Basically, we have a local musician the second Saturday of every month, and if you buy dinner in town, it's $5 to get in. You have to present your receipt from the night of the show from a local restaurant. If you don't buy dinner, it's $10, so it's still a good deal. And it's been going great. And the musicians, don't let the price fool you. They're super, world-class musicians. We were able to do this through the American Rescue Plan, ARPA funding. So we had funding for this. That's why we can do it. So it works out for everybody. So dinner and a show series, second Saturday of every month up until June. And we may continue into July, August if it keeps going as well as it has been. We have a lot coming up. Please take a brochure with you. Check the website regularly because we are constantly adding stuff. All right, so that brings me to tonight. These guys are two of my favorite artists. I was happy to introduce them. Sean asked me for a great musician that could play the piano behind his wonderful poetry, and I immediately thought of Quentin here, and I'm really excited to see what they put together. So please welcome Sean Murphy and Quentin Walston. Blackened Blues.
Thank you so much, Morgan. It's really an honor. This is not my first time here, but every time is special, and I always have a little bit of imposter syndrome because this space is so wonderful and perfect for art. To have any association with the Barns of Rose Hill is a genuine honor. So I want to thank Morgan and Nathan and the team here for always making it special. And again, just everyone for coming out on a Saturday night to enjoy some jazz and poetry. Two things that should go together, I think, but don't as much as they used to, maybe in a different era. So just by way of quick introduction, Morgan pretty much covered it. I did reach out to her and told her that for these poems from my book, it's called The Blackened Blues, is a project that came out of a lot of jazz writing I've done over the years, but it was really more from a critical perspective. I've written a lot of jazz criticism and music criticism and focused on writing fiction and poetry. And in recent years, I just realized that things bubbling around in my own mind, and I think culturally and societally, suddenly this energy to celebrate music that's moved me and taking a look at some of the lives of American geniuses who were not done well in American society. Some of this political energy and some of this critical energy started being expressed more creatively. So the impetus behind the Blackened Blues really is my very humble attempt to get some of these people who have saved my life on a number of occasions, these wonderful musicians, to give them some exposure. And so tonight, to me, is a real culmination, because this is really just a gateway to the music. So I'm here as much as everyone else to listen to the music. So it's a tremendous joy and honor to share the stage with Quentin. You'll see for yourself how amazing he is, but it's been a real blessing not only to have this opportunity to collaborate, but it's introduced me to him and his music. So it is absolutely my honor to be able to tee up some musicians and some words, which will then lead to an interpretation. So when Quentin and I worked on this, the program, it was pretty simple. I sent him the table of contents and said, which ones of these artists speak to you? Who would you feel comfortable doing a musical interpretation? So we hashed out a program, and what we decided to do is I would read the poem, and then we're going to be treated to a rendition of a particular composition from that musician. So what my hope is, I don't really have any hopes. I think this is going to be fun, but my hope is that we're giving an introduction, and if some of you haven't heard of some of these musicians, welcome to the rest of your life, because I think once you dive into some of this jazz music, it becomes obsessive and it's very positive. So, with that said, I think the best way to really kick things off is actually a poem that's not in the book, but this book is a short collection. It's part of a larger project. I've written, like over 60 poems in this series, but there's a poem that will be in the next book that I think introduces kind of some of the themes and obsessions and topics, and it will lead to a rendition of a song that many of us know called Summertime. And by way of introduction, this poem is kind of about summertime, which has been covered, from Gershwin and the opera Porgy and Bess, all through jazz, covered by Miles Davis, Ella Fitzgerald, Billie Holiday, Nina Simone, and Sun Ra, who gets and all of them get referenced in this poem. But it really contextualizes how I first became aware of the connection between jazz and culture, and how a lot of jazz music, especially in the 50s, was taking old Hollywood or old songs and radically reinterpreting them and reclaiming some of that culture. And to put a fine point on it, a lot of these were black musicians taking back music that had been appropriated or really watered down by pop culture. So there's almost a subversive element in some of these renditions. So I try to celebrate that a little bit. And in the song, I Loves You, Porgy, there's a line, I want to stay here with you forever. And that's the name of this poem. Even in the 1980s, it wasn't all bad, because in English 101, I first read Porgy and Bess, and it prepared me for some things, especially when, a few years later, Miles smiled, and I finally began to comprehend a thing or two that anthologies and history professors can never articulate. Words failing to explain things like context and cause and effect. And how could summertime break my mind, then build it back up each time, reaching me in its wordless way? Then along came Nina and Ella and Billie. So by the time I got to Sun Ra, I knew more about Gershwin and appropriation, and how, once again, black artists were obliged to reclaim their culture, elevating us all to places we wouldn't need to go if the American dream offered what was advertised. Words, again, talking a big game, but coming up empty in extra innings. And why I see Emmett Till and Rodney King when Sonny takes his solo, proving truth's always more painful than fiction because it feels real, even to not so innocent bystanders. And maybe that's why a recording from 1960 can kill me in all the right ways, suggesting something about humankind's deficiencies and redemption, and how wood brass and wind express what words never could. So you see, this is what it means when I admit I don't know the blues, but I understand them. Or possibly I've got that backwards, because my ears discern what my mind can't define. So far, so good. So when Quentin and I first started talking, we got right down to business and started kind of comparing notes, like who are your heroes, and it was not surprising that we found common ground right away. Yeah. But I think the first name that came up was Thelonious Monk. Mm-hmm. And Thelonious Monk, I mean, a lot of the people that are in this book, are really could almost exist as metaphors, because so many of them represent what we talk about when we talk about artistry and how hard it is to be an artist, and the difference between artists who do it honestly versus are after commercial gain. And then we start getting into the era of bebop, which was the 50s and into the 60s, when some of the most talented musicians in world history were treated in their own country as second-class citizens. So there's so many layers, and yet these people who suffered the indignity of not even being appreciated or able to make a living in their own homeland we're creating this music that is life-affirming and wonderful and inquisitive and unbelievable. So there's really rich stories, but Thelonious Monk is probably still one of the handful of geniuses that is a true iconoclast, is a true visionary who I think relished being misunderstood and played with the contradictions of, is he crazy? Is he acting crazy? And does that make the music better? Or does it take away from the music? But what he left behind is this catalog of music that continues to be covered by seemingly everybody because it's just so irresistible and brilliant. So I wanted to try to tackle this notion of how do we try to get a handle on the human behind this myth and this legend, and someone that did struggle with mental issues, but contained such unbelievable prolific energy. There's something more going on there. So for me as a writer, I'm really fascinated by how do we try to understand someone that was a human being and breathed the same air we all breathed. So this poem is called Thelonious Monk's Moods. Imagine the ocean and holding it back with only two hands and one outsized mind. Only God or the moon can move the tides. And since God is dead, that's a hell of a lot to ask of one man. So what do you do when the water keeps coming, wave after wave, the salty weight of this world crashing every other second on the shore, full of scoffed pebbles like stars scattered far out in space? What is music if not art, and the art of uncontainable energy checking itself? Notes from underground, a crepuscular kind of occupation, since custom or tradition or transcendence, lost in translation, compels it. Listen, you think we're ill-equipped to unravel these mysteries and what they're saying or from whence they came? Imagine being the man who heard them first, thinking and dancing his way through life's mess of magic and mystery, the loneliest monk transcribing such sounds like some new Bible, the ugly beauty of brilliant corners. If that piano could talk, it would sing a song of salvation and sorrow, and the ways we make ourselves insensible to the ecstasies, those man-made miracles some consider a sort of sustenance. They say Monk went silent because he said all he had to say, but couldn't it be true that he just got tired? Speaking or eavesdropping on himself, obliged to that breaking sea inside his head, not broken, but disabused. Unwell, watching immodest clock thumpers gone gray in stifling suits, evolved in the art of becoming invisible. Machines and the ghost making more money than sense, evading all engagement or anything not on display in boardrooms. P.S. The ocean, after all, and at long last, can always account for itself.
Thank you. I get excited anytime someone brings up Thelonious Monk. For many reasons. Before the show, Sean was kind of asking me about my journey getting into jazz, and I was kind of explaining getting ready for college to study jazz and stuff like that, and how blues had been a big influence, blues piano. And then he was kind of asking, like, what art, like, did it all come at once? Did you dive into certain artists, and what kind of really attracted you? And for me, Thelonious Monk was just such an enigma, and music that's been different or not really expected has always piqued my interest. So if there's something that's just slightly beyond what every other record sounds like, that's what I want to learn. I want to learn what he's doing, how is he doing it. And Thelonious Monk definitely has that quirkiness, as you heard, but there's such an added level of complexity with Monk, because you don't want to be making a mockery of his style or being a parody of his style. So it's definitely a very weighty challenge to play Monk. But Sean was also absolutely right when he said that Monk has been a huge influence in others in the music. I mean, Monk's output was somewhere around 90 songs, where Duke Ellington had somewhere around 1,200 songs, yet they're on equal footing as far as I'm concerned, and most of the jazz community is concerned, about how big of an influence and an impact they had. And what's also really remarkable about Monk is he kind of came into his style in the early and mid 40s. Genius of Modern Music came out in 1947. and the man just he found his style and he stuck to it. Like, you won't hear him really diverge or change. Most artists, if you listen to Cannonball Adderley in the 40s and then listen to him in the 70s, it's a completely different saxophone player. But Monk he found it, and he was going to be stubborn, and by golly, this is the music that I want to make. And I think that's really encouraging as a musician, as artists, but also just such a joy to behold someone that just loves their craft and found a musical voice and is determined to stick with it. So just some words about Monk and how much I've really valued him.
Thanks, Quentin. And, a lot of these poems are actually about how difficult it is to describe with words the magic of music and how inadequate words are. So once again, I say it's bringing life literally to what otherwise would be words on the page. So it's a tremendous honor to have the music come to life so brilliantly.
It was fun.
Thank you.
So one of the things I struggle with conceptually is a lot of these poems are pretty heavy and deal with some pretty heavy stuff. But there's also what I hope is a real sense of celebration for these defiant geniuses who, despite the trials and tribulations and the vicissitudes of modern life, did their work as best they could. And a handful of the poems kind of came to life. How does one get into someone like Billie Holiday or Thelonious Monk and try to do justice in a poem? And the answer is you can't. So it's kind of liberating because you don't need to. The point is the music speaks for their lives. But nevertheless, there were some specific incidents that inspired poems. And I don't know if anyone knows this story, but this poem begins, it's called Billie Holiday's Deathbed. And the poem begins with a news item, which this is actually the truth. I'll read it. On May 31st, 1959, as she lay dying at the Metropolitan Hospital in New York, aged 44, Billie Holiday was arrested, handcuffed, and put under police guard for possession of narcotics. And every time I read those words, every time I think about that, it infuriates me, and it seems, we've come so far in some regards. We have not come nearly far enough as a society, as a human race. But the image of an American genius, a fragile, suffering genius, handcuffed as she was dying to prove a point, is beyond metaphor. And I think that anger makes me appreciate her music and her struggle even more profoundly. But I also want to bear witness in my own way and call out those who disgraced themselves. So this is Billie Holiday's Deathbed. This busy bee at the end of a life like clockwork, a symphony of service to everything but herself, wings snatched in a world blinded by the way it is, slowly expiring in the sweet nectar of silence, stung with bittersweet poison, an alchemy of blinded faith. And even this they could not abide, their white-hot burden unappeasable, like anti-gravity drawing light inside its sense of self, righteous, obdurate, enfeebled from all their inherited fears. Who are these men that know nothing about the blues, inspiring jinxed history with officious ink, corrections bled red outside the margins, ignored or overcome, their shared voice warning, be more like me, or worse still, stay separate, apart, unheard, entitled or at least allowed to live. Strange fruit that rots inside dark spaces or gets torn down from trees, weeping their weary hymns of silence, caustic smoke signals blown from burning crosses. What do they know about beauty? Their hatred the only thing honest about them. What do they know about the helpless ones? Helpless for love, helpless for song, helpless for a fix, helpless for joy, helpless for hope. God bless the child that backward men would scorn, ignore, or erase, if they could.
Thanks so much. Yeah, when we were looking at the artists, it's like how do we tackle Billie Holiday as a very tragic life, just sexual abuse and drug abuse from a very early age. And when I was looking through Sean's poem, he quote I love your poetry, by the way, and it's just And for those of us here who might be very familiar with jazz music, he's been dropping all of these jazz titles like throughout all of his poems. So he mentioned "God Bless the Child" and "Strange Fruit," and I was like, maybe I should do one of those. And I didn't feel that I was really in a position to play "Strange Fruit." It's beyond me. I'm not of that era, and I could do best to sympathize, but I don't think I could properly play a song that's reacting to lynchings that were happening in the South. And then "God Bless the Child" was also a very good contender. But I decided to do "Fine and Mellow," which is one of the very few songs that Billie Holiday wrote herself. A lot of vocalists at that period, and Sean kind of brought it up earlier, would play songs or sing songs from theater, Broadway, film, Hollywood. So it was special that Billie Holiday wrote this one, and had such a simple but profound kind of blues feeling to it. And so I really have liked that one. There's a wonderful story about her playing with Lester Young on a recording where they were very, very close early in their careers. And this is during the swing era in the 30s, kind of when jazz combos this small style as opposed to a big band. The smaller ensemble was kind of new. They were very close, and then they parted ways, but they came back together on this recording, and there's such a beautiful emotion that was captured. So I played a little bit of Lester Young's solo in my own improvised section. So it's just such a beautiful song. So thanks for writing poetry for it.
Well, and thank you for that. That was really special, Quentin. That was magical. Wow. So at some point, if we're talking about jazz, we have to deal with Charlie Parker, another icon that you worry about jazz, some of these figures becoming cliches because they're so full of multitudes and they're so full of unbelievable stories. But I think the best way to describe Charlie Parker in brief is that we're talking about and celebrating a lot of geniuses, but one of the singular geniuses that even the geniuses name-checked and worshipped was Charlie Parker, because along with a couple of other folks like Dizzy Gillespie and Thelonious Monk, Max Roach, invented a whole new language called bebop, and really took things, it's impossible to avoid cliches, but took things to another level in terms of proficiency, in terms of passion, and elevated the art. And of course, the inherent contradictions. He struggled with drug abuse, struggled with racial strife, on a multitude of levels, always short of money. So to me, some of the contradictions of, a profound genius in American cultural history couldn't pay his rent. There's so much there to work with, but also this sense of joy and ebullience and brilliance. So I've actually got two short poems about Charlie Parker, kind of taking a look at two different angles of ways to try to approach this unapproachable master. The first one is kind of cheekily entitled "Miracle on 52nd Street." 52nd Street was one of the hotbeds during the bebop era, and Parker made that street famous, and it made him famous. So this is a short one called "Miracle on 52nd Street." A bird blew through 52nd Street with sounds you could see. It's not other colors, not yet. This was still black and white on every level, but deeper, darker, murky, becoming clear. Like how Eskimos have so many words for snow, artists, too, know there's no limit on finding ways to say the same thing. Different, but beautiful. More, they must find new ways to sing those songs. This is how language and ideas get found. Those who can hear what they're seeing carve out a path, not bringing light to the night so much as making the blacks blanker and the whites brighter. The way the sky dances into becoming clear and small in unthinkable darkness, lit and defined by stars glowing in space, themselves impossible to see without the absence of light that causes them to shine. The sound of science creating new life out of nothing. And then there's this is one of the early poems I wrote in this collection, and it kind of helped me structure what I was trying to achieve. I don't know what I was trying to achieve, but to try to get a artistic and creative grasp on some of these folks. This is pretty self-explanatory, but it's called Charlie Parker's Premonition. And I think it's an attempt in some ways to try to grapple with what do you do if you are aware that you're a genius and you can't even really understand what you've been blessed with, and how could any of us handle that kind of responsibility? So Charlie Parker's Premonition. At least Bach believed in God. This is what saved him. Can you fathom that freedom, the peace of such certainty? In thrall to exigency, at once owned, yet refusing ownership of one's art, accepting endowments that, on blessed occasions, override routine, and on hallowed days clamor for consummation in a voice you alone are capable of divining, or better still, chosen to channel, a commission you neither oppose nor suppress. Sadly for the faithless, God's accessible only through transcription, and often selects vessels not spiritually suited for the exchange. How would you handle the hot urgency of some holy inspiration if it awoke inside your mind, screaming like a starved exile? Could you mitigate earthly debt in the sacred currency of psalms? Or would you too require synthetic unction to abide the consecration of a million illimitable miracles, even if you scoff at such stuff?
Charlie Parker played a lot of notes. Sidetrack. Yeah, bebop is a language, and just to put on, if we could just think about music theory for just a second, and I won't get too crazy on you all. The Billie Holiday song and that song had the exact same chord progression, so the exact same structure. So that's what Charlie Parker did to the music. He took a song that had 3 chords, and he found out how to use every single note available to play over those 3 chords. So yeah, that's the triumph of bebop, and after Charlie Parker, you can't go back to the way it was. Like, it's before and after Charlie Parker. So that's the gravity of jazz pianists, or excuse me, jazz musicians, is to try to learn that language. And we're still trying to learn it, and the guy was playing in the 40s and 50s. So it's unbelievable.
And I'd just like to add, in addition to the unbelievable proficiency and passion that Quentin's bringing to bear, people that don't like or understand jazz, I think, tend to dismiss it, saying, yeah, it's all, the same. And just tonight, we're hearing these radically different styles and contexts, and so it's a credit to the talent, but it's also, I think, a illumination of, even within this world of jazz, which a lot of jazz musicians defy that label because they think it's too confining, but there's just a explosion of ideas and different styles and different personalities that shine through. So, throughout this collection and the larger project, there definitely are some complicated characters and complicated situations. One who presents no such difficulties is John Coltrane. And I mentioned that I'd written a lot of jazz criticism the last couple of decades. I've probably written as much about John Coltrane as I have about any musician. And I wrote a piece many moons ago that was intentionally, provocatively entitled, "No one has ever done anything as well as John Coltrane played the saxophone." It's a contention that I tend to stand by. But for those of you that don't know him, it's kind of like the Beatles in that, looking back, his period of peak productivity was about 10 years, certainly longer than that. But his peak period from 1957 until his untimely death, 10 years on one hand is like, that's a decade. It's not a lot of time. Time flies by, and the mountains and oceans of music that he left that we're still grappling with is defies description. But to make things even more complicated, he was, by all accounts, a generous, peaceful, quiet, gentle man, and all he wanted to do was play music. All he wanted to do was practice. Everyone loved him. No one had a bad thing to say about him. And he was a young man in his 40s and got cancer. And at the height of his powers was cut down by the most, banal of diseases. It's just an affront to everything that's fair, but we have no choice but to be appreciative of what we did get from him. So it's hard to write about your heroes, I think, sometimes, because how do you describe love without just saying, listen to the guy's work and appreciate him? But this poem is definitely from the heart. It's called John Coltrane's Cancer. Coltrane's calling. All he did was everything in his power, throwing sparks at the darkness, extolling what he alone conceived, the divine alchemy of his own design, sheets of sound with no barriers between pursuance, his spirit, and interstellar space, this gift, a supreme kind of love. But like some indefatigable oyster, filtering the sins from a fathomless sea, he transformed, instigating storms no human being can contain. And like any authentic prophet, with fire cloaked his expression, every revelation must supersede the messenger, even mortality, ever insatiable as it is. And so those bilious juices grew emboldened, their corrosive wake drowning him in everything he tried not to be. leaving him earthbound and anchored, even as his soul strained relentlessly toward infinity. And death, etiolated in the end, silenced him about as much as a passing shadow consumes the sun.
Thank you. That was Naima, a very abstracted version of that before the show Sean and I were talking, and I said, I have some arrangements worked out, but some of them, we'll just see what happens. And I really wanted to let Sean's poetry kind of inform the arrangement. And with these Titans, I mean, how do you boil down John Coltrane or Charlie Parker into one song, especially if you're familiar with Coltrane's music, especially his music from the 60s? Is just, sometimes it can be at the upper limit of just passion. It's just, he's practically screaming through his horn. And then at other times it's so contemplative and meditative that it is unparalleled to anything else. And I mean, his music is very, very spiritual. So given the subject of the poem, I definitely wanted to do more of that kind of meditative approach. So that was Naima, and it was completely improvised over the progression, but you notice there wasn't a lot of melodic improvisation like there was in Charlie Parker. So that was, I guess, a musical decision that I made for y'all who are keeping track of the music theory aspect. I'm a music teacher, I can't help but share. But anyway, thank you.
What a perfect illustration of the magic of jazz, that was largely improvised. And, a song I've heard, countless times and worship at. The arrangement and the way you attack that is just unbelievable. True honor to hear you do your thing. Wow.
Was amazing.
Oh, thank you.
The tension that you were building would just tear your soul apart.
Oh, I appreciate it.
And the calmness at the end of the death.
Yeah, thank you so
Magnificent.
I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Hear, hear. And yeah, I mean, obviously I am a fan of all these musicians, but if you've never checked out Coltrane, I think the good thing is, and Quentin and I were joking about this, I'm older than him, but I came of age, in a pre-digital era where you really did take leaps of faith when you bought a new album and hoped it was what you were looking for. But these days it's so easy, with the different streaming. So even going on YouTube and just putting in like gentle Coltrane, I highly recommend to anyone that hasn't had that pleasure, because Quentin's right, some of his stuff can get pretty intense, but the gentle ballads, and he did quite a number of them, are astonishingly beautiful and restorative. So I try to have, so Bud Powell is another early avatar of the bebop scene, in some ways as gifted as anyone we've talked about tonight. Another troubled soul, and his technique and his was just the confidence. He was kind of like, I would say, like a Michael Jordan of jazz, in that he knew he was great. He flirted with the intensity of being that brilliant, and maybe not completely well mentally. But there was a horrific incident when he was playing a gig and stepped out for a smoke break and was assaulted by a couple of cops, which was not uncommon. There was the cabaret card, which Thelonious Monk had taken away, which essentially was, the system's way of saying, we're going to ruin your livelihood, because if you didn't have that card, you couldn't play, and if you couldn't play, you couldn't make a living. But the musicians, Miles Davis has a famous story where he was hassled, just like, any black man probably got hassled any number of times. But there's one incident where Bud Powell, working for a living, making this unbelievable music, stepped out into New York City street to have a smoke, and a cop brutally beat him upside the head with his nightstick. And by all accounts, he was never the same, physically or mentally. So whether that exacerbated an existing condition, or he, really was a slow murder from unprovoked assault, it's an unforgivable, tragic incident. And what we lost with his life being cut short is, infuriating. But again, for me anyway, we think we have no choice but to appreciate that he was even amongst us and left what he did. But we need to bear witness to what happened. So I take a little poetic license in this one with the metaphors, so if you'll bear with me, this one is a pretty poetic poem, whatever that means, but it's called Bud Powell's Brain. Was it that hard-boiled cop's unindicted nightstick that scrambled your system, sending misfired messages into the soft wiring that polices ungovernable impulses? Or was collateral damage already done? Chemistry coalescing the onset of sickness, like a chick pecking through its shell. Uno poco loco, an epitaph for stillborn souls that can't escape the yoke of adversity. Nature's always improvising, uninterested in excuses or anything that could plausibly explain the roots of squares and circumstances of those serving them. Poached forever by the eyes of the white and the other color, printed in numbers on top of paper pyramids. E pluribus unum, a private club, your forbidden entrance, even decades after your death. A pitch black ever after that tastes and smells like vanilla extract and crackers, Jack. This world's never been accommodating to hard cases, helpless to understand languages they're confusedly fluent in, and like a conjoined twin, it smothers thoughts and steals oxygen from a disobedient brain, inflamed by anger or alcohol or something stronger. Risky antidotes for those inscrutable squawks you'll transcribe for anyone willing to open their ears, and better still, their wallets. Fat fortresses dispensing the only justice served after last call. Something you can score, like love or junk in any back alley, unless you can't afford the going rate, which means, like always, you're broke.
That's called Tempus Fugit, which I believe is Latin for time flies. And the original is even faster than that. And I think Sean hit the nail on the head. I mean, Bud Powell does have a certain amount of confidence in his music. In that one, I mean, there's instances of it just almost sounds like sheer anger in his music, especially the bridge with those big block chords. It's just like in your face, and yeah. So another bebop revolutionary, but definitely has his own style. So I think there's we could go on, and there's so much to be said about Bud Powell himself and another tragic story. But I think focusing on his contribution to the music is definitely worth having that supersede all else. So I'll let you.
Right on, and that's a good reminder that Quentin has music available in the lobby. So do check that out after the show, and you can take some of this home with you. So I usually have a lot of fun as a writer when people ask me who my favorite writer is, and I say Charles Mingus, and they say, "Isn't he a musician?" And I say, "Exactly." Charles Mingus is definitely one of my all-time heroes, and for a variety of reasons, all of them great. And I think if there was anyone in this collection that kind of incorporates everything we've talked about and literally incorporates a lot of the people we've talked about, I think it's Charles Mingus, because his music was kind of a encyclopedia of what had happened before him. So he was always paying tribute to the icons that went before him and incorporating and quoting from them, but then taking it to different places. And he gradually built his own catalog, which rivals Ellington and Monk's in terms of scope. But Mingus, as much as any of the folks we've mentioned, knew he was a genius. I mean, he knew he was a genius, and he struggled every step of the way. People didn't understand him. People didn't appreciate him. He was a difficult character. That's chicken egg. I think he was arguably difficult because it's so hard. It was so hard being a black genius in the 50s and 60s. But he persevered, and he just refused to be ignored. He triumph of will. He made music that couldn't be ignored. So suffice it to say, I would strongly encourage anyone checking out. And it's because of his anger and because of his troubles and turmoil. You'd think, well, boy, that must be some anger music. It's this most joyous and dialogue-filled. He has small bands where he can make a quintet sound like a big band. When he has a big band, it sounds like a stadium full of musicians. Just a prodigious person. But so speaking of how do you grapple with that, as in a poem, in the year 1957, he recorded and put out 5 albums in 1 year. And it's not just that he did that. They're all completely different. One of them is called Tijuana Moods, which goes south of the border and incorporates these sounds. One is based in New York City and invokes Gershwin and the sounds of New York. One's called The Clown, which is it's based in the blues and very passionate. But just the fact that he was still largely under-recognized, and in his autobiography he wrote, "It's finally my time. I can feel it." And I wanted to talk about that year as a microcosm of his life. So this is called Charles Mingus's Miracle. The thing about Charlie Mingus Jr., who clattered onto the scene like a grand piano in a punch bowl, is that he also was young once. More than that, fate made him endure indignities that make a street bum look like Reagan's strapping young buck on food stamps, savoring a T-bone. Systems so sullied, even mobsters did more than music critics. But, that's entertainment. I'm black, therefore I'm not. This is what 400 years of errors and trials, faith wrung out of unripened rinds, forced folks with the nerve to be born neither wealthy nor white to know from the get-go. And for the love of a stained glass god, don't speak off script, or they'll wash the mutiny from your mouth with a fire hose. That's why most men lie down mutely in darkness, safe or at least sheltered, beneath the underdog of hatred in history. Get them to kill each other, or even better, hoodwink them into hating themselves. That's the anti-American dream too many citizens sleep through, fed a fixed diet of indifference, intolerance, and interference. So what can you do if you know you're a genius and all the Klan's men can never convince you that water isn't wet? You just keep rolling that rock up the hill until it grinds a fresh groove into the earth. Improvise your own force majeure. This is almost my time, he said, and good God, wasn't he more than half right? I know one thing, you can quote him. I'm not going to let anyone change me. Overflowing with awareness of himself, fresh out of the furnace, molded in the image of a bird that flew first and further, mapping out the contours of this new language, which was dialogic, indomitable, his work exploded, a defiant weed cutting through concrete. 1957, 5 albums in 12 months, righteous waves quenching a coastline, reconfiguring the world the way nature does. And his reward? A brief stretch in Bellevue. Ain't that a bitch? Listen, when Duke Ellington declared music his mistress, he was lucky enough to need nobody, aware that the genetic razor cleaving obsession and insanity is capricious, like all those calamities Poseidon orchestrated. Mingus was never not human. The impossible endowment that drove him, destroyed him, and in death restored him. His tenacity was the heat that both healed and hurt. A comet cursed with consciousness. He went harder, dug deeper, even as his best work impended, yet unrealized revelations. Blues and roots, the brown man's burden, a thorny crown worn only by dispossessed prophets, willing or able to testify. His recalcitrant wisdom earned the way trees acquire rings, the reality of who he was, even if he too changed at times, like the country that claimed him, mostly after the fact. And whether you're committed, an exiled crusader, or a respectable suit working to death in squared circles, the message from that rare bird's song still resounds today, an epiphany blown through the slipstream. Now's the time.
You said making a big band sound like a stadium full, and I got inspired.
And you did indeed.
Yeah, Charles Mingus, man, what a powerhouse. He had so many influences. He had a lot of like the black church, kind of the gospel call and response. So that was very evident in his music, and very groove driven and just very joyous. It's amazing. You can't help but smile sometimes when you listen to his music. And he wasn't afraid to take risks and see his music is very compositional. He would write suites. One of my favorite albums of his is The Black Saint and the Sinner Lady. And it's a 4-part suite that's just unreal. And these are long movements. I mean, he wrote like 10 or 12 minute movements. And that's something that you wouldn't see in the bebop era, where a song would only be 3 minutes long. So, and also you hit the nail on the head. I mean, he played with Charlie Parker, and he played with Bud Powell, and he played with Thelonious Monk. So, yeah, what a huge man of a musician. So exciting, and also a challenge to try to do on piano. So I appreciate and I applaud all of your selections, and it's just been a real blessing and an honor to play with you, to play with you and to play for all of you. So thank you.
I'll just paraphrase what I said earlier, which is, at best, words are literally black and white, things on a page, and you try to bring them to life and describe and explain things, but it's the music that makes it all come together. So very special for me to quite literally see these words jump off the page and onto the keyboard. Absolute pleasure and a blessing. So your talent is amazing, and your friendship is important. So I thank everybody for coming out. What more can I say? I had a blast. I hope you enjoyed yourself too, and check out Quentin's music outside. There are some books out there, yes. But if I had a choice, I'd get the music.